back to the Abolitionist Table. My name is Cornelia, and today we're going to be talking about what is an abolitionist. Now, I've talked about the Abolitionist Table as an organization and how I formed this Abolitionist Table channel. We talked about the Abolitionist Table itself, I'm sitting in front of. So let's talk about what an abolitionist is. I didn't want to make the assumption that everyone knew what an abolitionist was. So here we go. Let's talk about what the definition of an abolitionist is and some nuances and what it's not. So as the dictionary defines, an abolitionist is specifically spoke to about slavery. That definition is wrapped in the enslavement. And so it talks about a person who favors the abolition of a practice or institution, especially capital punishment or formerly slavery. Now, when we see that capital punishment, what do we think about? We think about mass incarceration, right? The new Jim Crow, right? Because that's what's happened. I mean, that's something we should be working to abolish right now. Capital punishment is the exception to the 13th Amendment. It's the enslavement with the exception of capital punishment, right? So what is an abolitionist? Let's talk about what it used to be, but like people we know that have been recognized as abolitionists. So we talk about Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist, right? He was a former slave. He became free, and then he joined some organizations to go around, make speeches, go throughout the country, and work to get us free. He was one of the people that was, speaking to Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln at the White House. Frederick Douglass was a substantial figure in the abolitionist world. He was friends with and supported by William Lloyd Garrison, which was also a white abolitionist, because it wasn't just us, people that looked like me, that were abolitionists. We had people that truly believed that humankind should not be enslaved and be the property of others. And thank God for that, right? We had the Quakers, which is about the only religious organization that I've found predominantly that really stood up and was an abolitionist organization. They weren't just a religious group. They believed in the abolition of slavery. They not only believed in abolishing slavery, they believed in the equality of people, of humans. So that's a caveat, because one of the things I learned was that in history, there were abolitionists that had disclaimers. They believed in the abolishment of slavery, but they also believed that in white supremacy. They believed in the abolition of slavery, but they also believed in white superiority. So they believed that you shouldn't be property, but you also weren't equal. And that's a contradiction to me. Definitely a contradiction. But that's what I learned. Because some of the most prominent people that are named as abolitionists, i.e. Susan B. Anthony, were abolitionists, but with conditions. So who is Susan B. Anthony? Susan B. Anthony is in history. If you Google her now, she comes up as a staunch abolitionist. She was part of the women's suffrage movement. Meaning the white women's suffrage movement, because I always like to correct that, because that is the movement that believed in white women's right to vote. And initially, Susan B. Anthony, she was the type of abolitionist. She was part of the Quaker regime, if you will, and she believed in the meaning of the right to vote for all citizens, regardless of race or gender. She and this other lady named Elizabeth Cady, they believed in the 15th Amendment should include women's suffrage along with Black men's right to vote. Because that was the next step, right? Patriarchy is real. White men are at the top of the hierarchy. So that has white wealthy men were at the top of the hierarchy. Then you just have white men in general. Then you have black men underneath that. Then you have women, right? So at some point, she believed that the 15th Amendment should include white women's right to vote. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, after the Civil War, changed up. They decided that it was white women that needed the right to vote more than black men. She even said that white women were more educated and deserving of the vote than black men. But the 15th Amendment went ahead and said black men gave them the right to vote instead. It wasn't until the 19th Amendment, 1920, when white women were given the right to vote. So I like to talk about what's not an abolitionist. An abolitionist is not a person with conditions. An abolitionist is not someone who practices and believes in oppression. Let me say that again. An abolitionist is not someone who believes in oppression. And that's, in essence, what Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady were practicing. So much so that Sojourner Truth and Francis Allen Watkins Harper and Harriet Tubman all continued to advocate for universal suffrage for all women, for all people. But they had a split because they were excluded after all is said and done from the suffrage movement by Susan B. Anthony and their movement. In fact, one of the most interesting things I've done in the past year or so, I went on a tour to Uncle Nearest, which is in Shelbyville, Tennessee. Fabulous, go, go, go. A beautiful thing that Fawn Weaver has done. And during this tour, you go into like a speakeasy of sorts. And the speakeasy has a tour guide, and they talk about the time in which Jack Daniels was being, created, and the slave, the Mr. Nearest, Uncle Nearest, that created that formula that was then given to Jack Daniels, that went on to prominence, and Uncle Nearest was kind of written somewhat so out of history at Nearest Green. So during that discussion or that tour guide's speech, they talked about the women's suffrage movement, and they talked about Susan B. Anthony, and they talked about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I always kind of cringe a bit because the suffrage movement wasn't about me. It didn't include me. It didn't include Fawn. It didn't include Nearest Green's people either. It only included white women. It wasn't until 1965 that we were actually able to go to the polls and vote. And I personally, I personally have an experience with that because my mother that raised me was born in 1920. And so I was born in 1970. So she only was afforded the right to vote in Mississippi 5 years before I was born. The bulk of her life, she lived without that power, without that privilege. But I tell you what, growing up, we would go to all kinds of polling stations, and they never looked safe and fun. They were always in the backwoods of somewhere around the corner of something. The polling stations never looked like a place that was safe. But my mama never missed an election. She always participated and exercised her power and right to vote. Something we'll talk about later. So we talked about what an abolitionist isn't. We can talk about what an abolitionist was and who those people were. Harriet Tubman was an abolitionist. John Brown was an abolitionist. Of course, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Byron Ruffkin. Thaddeus Stevens was an abolitionist. Abraham Lincoln was not. So we have to be able to distinguish these things about who people are and the truth of who they are in history, who they represented. Like, for instance, When we talk about the founding fathers of the United States, the founding fathers of the United States and the penners, the people who penned the Declaration of Independence, we weren't included in that conversation. We weren't thought of when they were creating that document. Approximately half of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the delegates to the Constitutional Convention owned slaves. Owned slaves. The first 12 presidents of the United States of America owned slaves. So when they were writing these documents and they were fighting this Revolutionary War, they were getting freedom for who? Not me. Not you. If you look like me. That's just a truth. It's just a hard, honest truth. Nothing else can be said about that. There's a period there's a period at the end of that sentence, but it's not wrong to know the truth, because knowing the truth helps you understand what you can do better and helps you understand what's the difference and what was and what can be. So one of the things also that kind of makes me think about what an abolitionist is and what an abolitionist isn't is terms of today we use. We talk about allyship and we talk about accomplices. I've always kind of favored accomplices because I have been in spaces where I've done anti-racism teaching with people who did not look like me and still do. And I explain the differences. I always say I want Angeline Grimke's and Viola Lizzo's in my abolitionist book. If I have a abolitionist table that I want to take, I want to be able to take those, because those people had sacrifice. Those people put themselves in harm's way. Angeline Grimke was a daughter of one of the wealthiest plantation owners in South Carolina. She grew up with money. She grew up with enslaved people in her company, in her house, in her life. And she grew up and said that was wrong. And she became an abolitionist, outspoken, telling, screaming, making speeches to abolish it, to make it go away, to do something different. She sacrificed herself. Somewhat, right? She put herself in harm's way, her and her sister, speaking out against slavery, something that her father, her family, herself had been a part of. Viola Lizzo, of course, is the lady from Detroit, Michigan, who saw the stories on television and decided to go to Selma to help with the Selma voting rights. She was driving people around. She was doing all types of things in service of a cause that she really didn't have to. And she paid with her actual life. She left her children. She left her husband. She had a cause. She was an abolitionist. Now, I'm not asking for people to put their lives in harm's way. But I am asking for people like myself, people like yourself, people that look like me and people that don't. Be careful how you coin yourself with phrases that carry weight. I had some people around here in Tennessee in the last 5 years that I've known and I was friendly with, people that didn't look like me, that were in prominent positions in government and office. And unfortunately, they came under fire because of a lot of stances they took here in Tennessee. And they were in a position that they had never been before. They were not invited to parties anymore. They weren't included in conversations and things that they had normally seen. They told me they didn't recognize the people that they had formerly called friends. It became so difficult for them. They sold their house and they moved out of the state of Tennessee. They weren't the only ones. Several couples left the state of Tennessee because they had come under fire. They had come under fire and were treated similarly to what we have experienced our entire lives. They just got a little taste of it and they had to go. So what the beauty of it is that they did a lot of speaking out and they did a lot of allyship, if you will, when they were here. And when they moved, wherever they moved, they are quiet now. They really recognize, I believe, what that whiteness was. And they weren't willing to put themselves in any type of harm anymore. They changed their zip code. They changed their opinion. They changed their stance. They changed their dialogue. And now they're back to normal. To the normal they were accustomed to. That's not an ally. That's not an ally. For me, it's not. My definition of it is not. Two of the most different abolitionists that would be coined, I guess, in our community would be Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. They were on opposite sides to some degree. Now, when I was growing up, Booker T. Washington was talked about and heralded as this great black man who had created Tuskegee and done all these things. And he did. And he did. There is an exception that I learned that Mr. Washington took with his disclaimer for abolition. He was a former slave. And of course, he didn't believe in slavery. But he also didn't believe in equality. He did not believe in the equity of humankind that we possess. And that's the reading I want us to talk about in the reading club. He gave a speech in Atlanta. It's called the Atlanta Compromise. It's just a small reading. It's not huge, but it's something that I don't think we as in my age group or we just in general kind of talk about. Because a lot of us are living under that same umbrella that Booker T. Washington extended during that speech. I'd like us to talk about it. I'd like us to read it. I'd like us to understand it. And I'd like us to really abolish the summary position that Mr. Washington provided. We are truly living in that same atmosphere in 2025. One of the things that I recognize about the Quakers is that they were the only religious group that stood up and stood against slavery. They took a real hard stance on it. They even put into their own laws their stance. In 1776, Quakers were prohibited from owning slaves. And in 1774, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting forbade Quakers from buying or selling slaves, requiring masters to free slaves at the earliest opportunity. Now that's a little weird, but at the earliest opportunity is a little weird. But they did at least put pen to paper. They put policy in action and said, we do not support this. We do not condone this. And that's something that most other religious organizations did not. They didn't take that stance. They didn't take that stance. And even today, many of them, though they have in their history books, because I have many of them have owned their participation in chattel slavery. I don't see many of them, meaning the people that don't look like me, religious organizations, I don't see many of them reconciling any of their participation in the past, any of their profit from their participation. One of the things I had looked for years was, how did this become so commonplace that whiteness was superior? Like, I am inferior because of my skin. You are superior because of your skin. How did this become so thickly cemented into culture, into the American story, into the religious story? And one of the things I found was a book, an old book from 1911. And this is an advanced geography Catholic regional school book. So in Catholicism, they would, you heard of Catholic schools, and they would have these books, and they would be endorsed, and they would teach the same thing. We're saying the same speak throughout our region. So this was one from the southeastern region. And I found this book, and in this book, a couple things stood out to me. And this is in the introduction of the book. The book is riddled with all types of things. One of the things that it puts at the forefront of this book is that the creation of race. And I know and have unlearned that race is a social construct created as a hierarchy to oppress other groups. That's all it is. It's just made up. It's just something that somebody said, we are better, you're not. We're a winner, you're a loser. And that's just the way it is. And I've heard people even characterize it as winners and losers. So this book, in the introduction, it goes over the geography and it talks about the different human races. And the funny thing, when it's describing the races, it has all these small characteristics. It talks about the yellow race is from far off Asia. It talks about the black race in Africa. It talks about the brown race that inhabits Southeastern Asia. And then it talks about the red race, now nearly extinct, which formerly roamed over America. America was their place. They didn't roam. So that's kind of what they said there. But it also says this. And what is most important, because it's telling the children the introduction of what this book is, what they'll learn, what they're expected to understand about this book when they're going through this advanced geography course. It says, what is most important, you will learn much more about your own race, our own race, the most advanced of all, the white race. This is in writing. This is taught, right? This is a historically Catholic textbook teaching children that you will learn much more about our own race, the most advanced of all, the white race. So this isn't just model. This was taught. This is just the Catholic version, but there are all the other versions as well. Okay? Now here's the other thing that I remember reading. It will tell you also how the people of our race, more favored by Almighty God than the others, have spread out from Europe until America and some other great lands have been lost to the races which formerly dwelt on them and have become the homes of the white race. This is what the book says. It says they are more favored by God Almighty, and they are more advanced than any other race. This is a textbook. This was taught. This was taught to children about me. being inferior. This is what we abolitionists are warring against. This is what abolitionists would fight against. True abolitionists, without disclaimers, without conditions, without exit criteria. This is what the sacrifice is about. This is what an abolitionist is. This is the fight that we all step up to the plate every day, working to remove, working to unlearn, working to abolish things and residue that has been left over for hundreds and hundreds of years. So, are you an abolitionist? Are you a Harriet? Are you a Viola? Are you an Angeline? I think we all should be. I think an abolitionist should be at the forefront of our minds to be able to get rid of the things that we don't need. Get rid of the things that aren't advantageous to humankind. So, that's what an abolitionist is. I have really enjoyed talking to you guys about what an abolitionist is. I hope it's understood. I hope we understand some of the history of who the abolitionists were. And I hope giving some context to what abolitionists aren't helps you understand how to recognize and what to look for and what to challenge and what to interrupt. Because what we don't need to do is to be excited about someone saying they're on our side. Everybody that says they're on our side, until we see the actual side, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just words. Action is the only way you really come to understand the character of a person, the activity of a person, the willingness of a person. Because without sacrifice, in some context, you aren't real. You aren't willing to sacrifice. You're not considering sacrifice. You're not being uncomfortable. You're not trying to interrupt anything. And that's what we need to do. We need to interrupt. We need to sacrifice. We need to challenge. Because all these things have been going on forever. We need abolitionists. I'm calling for abolitionists. I'm wanting us to all become abolitionists and figure out what we need to abolish today. This movement that they had, this movement of societies, and they had groups, they had movements. The Underground Railroad doesn't need to not exist anymore. We need our own type of underground railroad. Seriously, underground. We don't need to be out in the open all the time, marching and protesting. There's a place and time for protesting. But a lot of what happened back during that time was a strategy of sacrifice, a strategy of willingness to interrupt the narrative of wrong. There were things that people talked about quietly. There were things people talked about loudly. But the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery, happened with those that were willing to interrupt, to object, to raise their hand, to say stop, no more, and to figure out a way to destroy those things that were harmful to the human race. They didn't have to impact them specifically. It just had to impact them. It just had to impact the human race because we're all connected. We're all connected and we all need each other. So I'm calling on you. Become an abolitionist. Learn what you need to abolish. What do you need to abolish? What do we need to destroy? What do we need to interrupt? What do we need to sacrifice to move something forward and move things out of our way that are keeping us from freedom? Let's think about that. Because we got work to do. And guess what? We are the ones we've been waiting for. Nobody coming. We don't have a rescue book or rescue person or rescue organization. We're not waiting for the next leader to be born. You are the leader needed. You are the person needed for this time, for this community, for your family, for your friends, for your part of the country. You are the abolitionist that's needed. So let's work on that. Let's figure that out. Thank you for joining the Abolitionist Table. I appreciate you joining me. Next week, we'll be talking about something a little fun, a little lighter. I have a couple of special guests that will be joining me, and we'll be talking about the clothing optional trend, kind of on the heels of Queen Mother Felicia Rashad's statements about how she felt about young ladies dressing or lack of dressing these days. I've had something similar. I've had some thoughts that were similar, but I also have some thoughts about it. I've had some similar thoughts, but I also understand that there's context and there's a discussion needed. Do we need to abolish it? Do we need to change it? Do we need to talk about it? Do we need to modify it? I don't know. I'm going to put it on the table and let's talk about it and let's discuss it and let's see what happens when we have the conversation, interrupt the narrative, walk into the uncomfortable. Thank you for joining. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel. I appreciate your support. Until next time, we are the ones we've been waiting for.